Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, adapted from the novelization by J.R. Millward, based on an original story by A. Murty Schofield, with J.R. Millward and Adam Coover, with music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Episode 18.
The Cabal had been here before me. Stout wooden props supported the tunnel. Plastic ties in day-glow orange were knotted around the beams and marked out a pathway like a trail of waterproof breadcrumbs. At about 6 meters down, the tunnel leveled off. Roughly hewn bedrock gave way to architecture. Most of it imported limestone, significantly paler than the native rock. A flicker of movement startled me, but it was only a forlorn-looking trout darting down a passageway. Motes of debris sparkled in the light from my torch, but otherwise the tunnels were blacker than the monstrum's heart. The steady exhalation of my bubbles was the only sound. Cave diving of any kind is not for the faint-hearted. Not knowing how far I'd have to swim, I'd made sure my air was mixed for a prolonged dive. Having too much oxygen in the ratio was as potentially deadly as too little. My training in buoyancy control quickly came back to me and helped me to avoid kicking up clouds of vision-destroying silt. A hazard I've had to deal with far too often whilst diving in enclosed spaces. Fortunately, the passageways were largely free of the wretched stuff. As I swam on, I became aware of a gentle current. That, coupled to the presence of fish, hinted at an exit, perhaps flowing to the Vltava River. Or it could be a siphon, where the river or one of its tributaries had found a way underground from the surface. Either way, I'd have been a fool to rely on the current for navigation. Half an hour went by, then an hour, and there was still no end to the passageways. Several of them had been rendered impassable by cave-ins, while others, once followed for 10 minutes, led me straight back to a hallway I'd already explored. The Lux Veritatis had been devilishly clever. A maze was a good deterrent to thieves at the best of times, but building one underwater was downright diabolical. I began to see why Eckhart was having problems gaining access to the vault. He was still looking for it. My tank's air supply dipped to 2/3, then a half. Any diver with an ounce of sense would have turned back at that point. By rights, I had reached the safe limits of my exploration. My teeth left marks in the mouthpiece where I chewed down. For all I knew, the vault was just around the next corner. It seemed criminal to give up now. But if I wanted to live long enough to make another attempt, there was no choice. I kicked to turn around, swallowing impotent rage, when movement caught my eye. Bubbles glittered in the torchlight, like a million pearls as I breathed out. They pinwheeled and floated away, not towards the ceiling, but in the direction I'd just come from. Curious, I followed with lazy sweeps of my flippers. Each time I exhaled, a new cloud of silvery beads would drift off down the passageway, drawn by a current too faint for me to have otherwise detected. About 5 meters along the tunnel, the bubbles took an abrupt left turn. My excitement swiftly mounted as I watched them scurry through the wall, disappearing through the cracks between each carved stone. I brushed a hand across the wall, dislodging flakes of crumbling mortar. These passageways were old. They were also, as it turned out, quite easy to break through, given a few good kicks. I wriggled through the newly created opening, taking care not to snag my equipment. Clouds of stirred-up debris faded swiftly. A wall of darkness engulfed my vision in every direction, too vast for my punny torch to penetrate more than a few meters. Warily, I circled the chamber's perimeter and discovered several things in quick succession. Firstly, that the room I'd entered had been crafted by master sculptors of the kind rarely seen outside of a museum. Second, I'd found the key to opening the vault. And thirdly, that placing life-size statues of fully armoured Lux Veritatis knights, where a torch-wielding archaeologist might chance upon them in the dark, is guaranteed to make said archaeologist swear and nearly drop her mouthpiece in shock. The statues loomed in a circle, facing each other like the numbers on a clock face. There were 8 of them, all carved from the finest Carrara marble, holding their swords in a salute to their opposite partner. A closer inspection revealed that each statue had a name plaque at its feet. Lemieux, Vasily, Montségur, Guilhem, and others, similarly French or Germanic in origin. Briefly, I wondered if Vasily's family tree extended into the modern era, and if Matthias, the art dealer, had any connection to this place. I pushed my musings aside and finished my assessment of the chamber. Amongst all the Renaissance grandeur, one feature looked out of place. Behind each statue was a chain stretching from floor to ceiling. Whether by magic or miracle, the iron gleamed as though it had been forged yesterday, without any trace of rust. My time was running out depressingly fast. Each knight is standing in his own channel. The statues were designed to slide back and forth from the circle's center point. The chains are the interface, clearly, but you still need to know which knights to move, the order to move them, which ones to leave alone. There! The torch's narrow beam had fallen onto the chamber's far wall, where a scene was wrought in bas relief. 2 knights stood partnered in a classic en-garde position, their swords raised and crossed at the tips. The knight on the left was crowned with a large Roman numeral L, whilst his partner was named V. There was an inscription between them, and the letters had been overlaid in shining gold. Fratribus collates innua patent. The brothers reunited see the gates thrown open. My air alarm beat. 5 minutes. I tried not to panic as I swam another slow circuit of the statues. L and V? Was it a reference to the Lux Veritatis, or to the knights themselves? only 2 of the knights had names beginning with either L or V. More in the hope than the expectation, I dove at Limou's chain and hauled down with all my strength. To my delight, the statue of Limou began grinding along its channel towards the circle's centre. A few moments later, Vasily's statue joined him. The tips of their swords crossed, touching each other. In total silence, the swords began sparkling with blue light. In less than 5 seconds, they had grown too bright to be seen, casting a pink glow through my eyelids, even with my hand raised as a shield. I would have sworn that nothing, short of ground zero at an H-bomb testing site, could have shone so brightly. I felt the tremors and darted to the side, avoiding the thump and grumble of huge chunks of masonry tumbling through the water. For a terrifying instant, I thought I'd been blinded. Then the purple scarlet blotches began to fade, but I could just make out the feeble glow of my torch. Nevertheless, it was enough to show me a newly blasted hole in the roof. With 19 seconds of air remaining, I broke the water's surface. Relief vied with joy as I pulled off my mouthpiece and goggles. My torch spluttered and died, as though realizing that its task was over. But in no time I had hauled myself out onto dry land and snapped a couple of emergency flares to keep me going. By their one yellow light, I stripped out of the wetsuit and pulled on my normal clothes. I wolfed down a couple of high-energy bars. Swimming always leaves me famished, whilst taking a quick stock of my gear and supplies. It felt good to have weapons holstered at my side again. Before I moved on, I refilled my water bottle from the vault, tossing in a couple of purification tablets for good measure. I tried not to dwell on the fact that, unless there was another way out, I was now trapped in the vault. One problem at a time. There's still a painting to find first. Atta girl. You might try heading for that light over there. What light? Wait, how can you see anything? It's pitch black in here. Because I devote more energy to examining the minutiae of your sensory data than you do. While you're busy wondering if Curtis has found the 3rd shard yet, I'm triple-checking what your senses are trying to tell you. There's a lot more information around than you normally take time to analyze. I'm not thinking about Curtis. Why are you bothering to hide it? Really, Lara? This is getting tiresome. Fine. I hope he's all right. There's little point in me finding the last painting if he can't get hold of the shard to destroy it. And I just hope he's all right. There was indeed a light coming from ahead, but in the stifling darkness, I relied more on the flares to guide my way. The cavern floor was uneven and rocky, with treacherous potholes lurking in every dip and shadow. A misstep would mean a twisted ankle at best, and a fall into a bottomless chasm at worst. The air smelt faintly sulphurous, like old parchment. A few steps later, as I rounded a corner in the cavern, I discovered why. Curtis, if you could only see this. In wonderment, my steps led me through the arched doorway. My expectations had placed the emphasis firmly on the vault part of Vault of Trophies, but nothing about the place here in front of me obeyed such pedestrian notions. There was an applewood fire crackling cheerfully in its grate at the far end of the room, filling the air with subtle sweet fragrance. The moth's wing flutter of candlelight from a dozen candelabras felt welcoming after the long darkness. Gargoyles with angelic faces peered down at me from atop rafters and buttresses of aged blackened oak, on a scene seemingly plucked from a 14th century castle. Books were everywhere, arranged on mahogany shelves that reached almost to the ceiling, from grand tomes bound in flaking scarlet or green leather to tiny volumes wrapped in layers of Chinese silk. There were piles of scrolls, all neatly tied with faded purple ribbons, next to stacks of loose parchment weighed down with obscure brass instruments. The dust-dry, papery smell sent tingles down my spine, making me itch to explore the secrets they contained. But the vault wasn't just a repository of knowledge. Tattered war banners hung from the ceiling, overshadowing the weaponry displayed wherever there was a spare inch of wall. Maces and morning stars, long swords and battle axes hung alongside enamelled shields bearing the Lux Veritatis crest. The candlelight gleamed along the killing edges and sparkled off polished suits of armour standing guard at the end of each shelf. Each knight wore a surcoat of royal crimson trimmed with ermine, with the symbol of the Lux Veritatis stitched across the breast in gilt thread. Their gauntleted hands were crossed across the pommels of long swords of flambard design, each one a work of the blacksmith's art. The jewels from a single hilt could have ransomed Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, Charlemagne, or all three put together. That tapestry, the one opposite the fireplace, it's identical to the painting Carvier had in her office. The crucified man, the hood, the castle in the background, every detail is the same. Carvier was good at her job. Why else would the great Werner von Croy ask her for help in researching the obscura paintings? He always chose the best of everything. Now, let's wrap up this mission and find the last painting. I know it's cozy in here, but Curtis is probably getting bored waiting for us. The last feature of note in the room awaited my inspection. An oak table, long enough to seat 8 fully armoured knights. I tiptoed closer, peering around the single high-backed chair, and drew back hastily at the sight of its occupant. The man had been dead a long time. Only his bones remained, the jaw hanging slackly and head turned aside, as though he had just nodded off to sleep one night and never awakened. The remains of velvet robes, heavily embroidered, clung to his withered frame, and a golden crucifix peeped from around his neck. Cautiously, I rummaged through the objects laid out before him. A pewter goblet and stacks of books, a half-burned candle and the rusted remains of a sword. The man's hand rested upon an open book whose pages crawled with sketches annotated in Latin. De Nephilae Corporis Fabrica, I read, swallowing distaste at the outlandish subject matter. It looks like he died in the middle of his studies. Now there's an artist who enjoyed mixing work and pleasure. What do you think he was? An opium addict or just plain crazy? I'm hoping it's the former. Those Things aren't creatures I want to encounter in real life. Indeed, they are rather... Stop! Go back. The pages are raised slightly in the middle, can't you see? She was right. My eyes couldn't tell, but my fingers could. Beneath the layers of crackling, tissue-thin parchment was an object, hard and unyielding. My heart thumped faster as I drew out my knife and used the tip to slide the pages apart. There, under the layers of ancient camouflage, nestled in a custom-cut recess like a priceless jewel, lay the fifth and final Obscura painting. My hands were shaking. It would have taken thieves days to go through this room, never knowing that what they sought lay right under their noses. The skeleton's eye sockets flickered in the firelight, as though the man were winking at me from across the centuries. With great care, I levered the painting out and blew to remove the dust. The scene had been painted in oils, with the figure of death leaning over the shoulder of an unsuspecting blonde man clad in scarlet. Like its companion from the Louvre, it was painted on a thick wooden base with an ornately carved frame and fitted easily into my palm. I felt a pang of empathy for poor Boromir. It was indeed a strange fate that so much could depend on so small a thing. Congratulations, it's ours. Now, a small matter of escaping this place? I'm open to ideas. Well, how long can you hold your breath? I paced over and leaned against the fireplace, staring into the flames. The homely crackling would have been soothing under any other circumstances. Well, we did find the painting. Let's not be too downhearted. Maggie, unless you know a way of turning that painting into an aqualung, it's not going to do us much good. Come on, Lara. You've got yourself out of impossible situations before. To be sure. It's good to hear you haven't forgotten that fact. So, now that you've finished moping, you can pay attention to the fireplace. What the, fireplace? What about it? It's lit, yes, but so are the candles. Maggie, this always happens to us. You already know my theory about lighting fixtures inside previously undiscovered tombs. I've explained it in some detail. Then, have you also noticed that there are no logs on the fire? I drew back. The flames danced in thin air, with nothing physically in the grate for them to feed from. The heat felt real enough, though. Magic. That's cheating. Magic, science, eventually they all boil down to the same thing. We've already seen that the Lux Veritatis have some supernatural knowledge, in so much as they employ reanimation curses. Crafting everlasting flames can't be much harder than that. And speaking of guardians, I'm a little surprised our friend at the table hasn't woken up for a chat. Just a minute. There's something here I can't make out. Can you see anything? My eyes started watering as my subconscious awareness rose to the fore. My inner companion had been correct in pointing out the deficit between data gathered by my senses and my overall perception. Even when we open our eyes and see, there is still a frightening amount of information that we miss. That's what gives optical illusions their power, and why I no longer took anything my eyes told me for granted. They're too easily deceived by what we expect to be in front of us. The logless fireplace was a perfect example. There's a passageway behind the grate. Quite a long one, too. An emergency exit? In an instant, I turned, guns drawn. A whisper, like the hiss of escaping steam, came from the skeletal scholar. Its fingers clenched, scratching at the place where the painting had once lain, and its fleshless skull turned in my direction. Movement in the corner of my eye resolved itself as the suits of armour lifted their swords, gleaming blood red in the firelight. Eyeless helms focused on me from every corner of the room. Like men rousing themselves after a long sleep, the vault's armoured guardians stepped down from their racks and advanced. Oh, sorry about that. Me and my big mouth, huh? No, not now. If you can't help me out, then keep quiet. I sighted on a pair of gauntleted kneecaps, my heart rate rising. The bullets tore through the steel plate with bursts like thunder, but did not slow his progress. His cohorts circled towards me, flanking me with glittering steel. I leapt onto the table as a guardian swung his greatsword, the blade singing as it just missed my belly. I kicked and sent his helmet flying into the nearest wall with a ringing clang. With a dancer's sure-footedness, I tap-danced down the table, avoiding the scholar's grasping claws. Another sword scythed towards my legs, and empty helmets glared as their owners crowded in to finish me off. I holstered my guns, knowing they were useless, and took a standing leap onto the nearest bookcase. Dust and paper slithered and slid as I hauled myself to the top and made a grab at one of the display halberds. It was heavier than I'd expected. 6 feet of mature oak, topped with a hooked steel axe used for dragging hapless men from battlements and slicing them open from groin to jaw. Twisting under my load, I dropped awkwardly to the ground, but kept my footing. Come on, just try it. There was no need to worry about technique. The blade decapitated 2 guardians and toppled 3 more just on its first swing. Another sent a whole suit of gilded armour crashing into the far wall, as noisy as a crate of horseshoes being hit by a train. I levelled my weapon, panting in triumph. Armour lay where it had fallen, transformed from animated automata to scattered museum pieces. I felt myself grin, fierce in victory. Until I heard that dry hiss once more. The scholar had risen and stood with his back to the fireplace. A ghastly silhouette with eyes that bored straight into mine whilst the flames rose higher and higher. A bony finger pointed in my direction and beckoned. From every corner of the room, pieces of armour skittered and rolled. The shattered remains of my halberd's victims swarmed together like a reverse explosion, and each fragment reassembled with its neighbours with terrifying speed. In less time than it takes to say, the lux veritatis never play fair. 12 newly completed sets of 14th century armour clanked to attention and turned their sightless faces towards me. They drew their swords in perfect unison, and the blades shone like the glint in death's eye. Bloody hell. We're supposed to be on the same side, damn it! The Guardian's skeletal master regarded me steadily, and I swallowed, aware that my only hope of escape lay through him. My hands tightened around the halberd's shaft. Whether I survived or not, this was going to hurt. Buggeration. I swung the blade in a wide arc. It smashed through the scholar's ribcage and cleanly sliced through the rope hanging beside the fireplace. The scholar shrieked, a sound no living human could reproduce without rusty nails and a blackboard, as the tapestry behind him sagged and collapsed. A trailing edge fell and caught a candelabrum, setting a flame that raced across the fabric and began devouring everything in sight. Parchment crisped and spat, and there were crashes as weapons parted company with the walls. In seconds, rolling heat and smoke had engulfed most of the room, cutting me off from the Guardians who were echoing their master's unearthly cries. I barely heard them above the sound of my own screaming as fire engulfed me in its blistering arms. I timed my leap carefully, breaking into a forward roll just in front of the grate. The flames swept over me, lashing whips of heat. Before the pain even registered, I was falling clear on the other side and not letting my momentum fail even for an instant. Tears were pouring down my cheeks, but I did not cry out. I was too busy gritting my teeth and rolling to extinguish the flames licking through my clothing. The stink of scorched hair filled my nostrils as I trailed wisps of smoke. Furiously, I struck off from the ruin of the fireplace, heading deeper into the darkness. From behind me came anguished howls and hissing, and a flash of metal whizzed past my elbow. This time I really did scream. Beyond the wash of hot blood and pain, I felt Maggie rise and force my legs to keep me moving. My heart pounded so hard I thought my chest would burst. At last I rounded a corner. The firelight was cut off, leaving me in darkness so complete it made no difference whether my eyes were open or closed. After another minute of crawling, I judged that whatever was behind me had given up the chase. There was no sound other than my own ragged breathing. By the light of a flare, my third from last, I checked my injuries. Blood shone blackly in the greenish chemical glow, but the scratch wasn't as bad as I'd feared. Most of the pain came from where a hand-sized throwing axe had torn away the bandage, covering Topiary Man's earlier handiwork. I had blisters on my upper arms and thighs. The rest of me had been tucked out of harm's way when I dived through the fire. Burns are horrible injuries. Even small ones hurt out of all proportion. The best I could do in my present circumstances was to slather antiseptic cream onto the worst patches of skin. It smarted worse than rubbing lemon juice onto a paper cut, but I bit my tongue and kept at it until the tube was empty. My dwindling first aid supplies yielded up a single bandage, which I wrapped around the gash on my arm, tying the knot with my teeth. My head throbbed, although I couldn't remember hitting it. I was exhausted. My 3 days on the run without decent sleep were starting to make themselves felt after all the excitement. Good girl. Don't you dare fall asleep on me. Come on. I can hear water close by. Maybe it's a way out. Wasn't going to sleep. You will let me know if I start showing signs of concussion, won't you? Absolutely. Reassured, I lifted the flare and began feeling my way along the passageway with my free hand. I couldn't afford to give in now. The tunnel narrowed. The silence pressed in, and for an awful second my memories overwhelmed me with claustrophobia. It had been like this beneath the pyramid, although without the benefit of flares to guide my way. At least they would give me the benefit of seeing where I might end up dying. 3 cheers for positive thinking. Several long, slow breaths helped me push those fears aside. 2 years ago, I'd emerged from the ruins and been reborn, under the gaze of watchful eyes both young and ancient beyond imagining. Thinking of Salir and Putai gave me strength, and my thoughts turned to the pendant I wore. I'd promised to return it one day, and that promise also lent me the willpower to press on. And I had the final painting. Together, Curtis and I held Eckhard's demise in our hands. My hand splashed into cold water. I drew back, startled, and raised the flare, bringing my attention back from its wanderings. The tunnel ended in a mirror-dark pool. It was so deep that my light did not touch the bottom, and so clear that I could count the glints of quartz buried in the walls. My thoughts inevitably turned back to my aqualung wetsuit, but they had gone far beyond my reach. There was no turning back. My only chance lay ahead, one way or another. Horace, if you're listening, I have a promise to keep. You wouldn't want me to break it now, would you? Cracking a fresh flare, I dived in. The cold was absolute and obliterating. I would have screamed, but for the determination that kept my mouth clamped firmly closed. If you've never gone skinny dipping above the Arctic Circle, then you've no idea how agonizing such immersion can be. My pulse rate shot up to over 200 beats a minute, demanding that my lungs be refilled. 1,000 knives assaulted my skin, striking to my major organs. The shock was so intense that I lost all sense of where I was. But my subconscious didn't. Come on, legs, let's get moving. That's it, down we go. Lift that flare up. There, head left. Come on, calves, what are you complaining about? It's only water. That's it, keep swimming. You're doing well, don't stop now. There's an opening to your right, harder. My body obeyed her without question. Had I been able to think straight, I would have wondered why she sounded so like my old PE teacher. The cold passed the point of pain, leaving only the dull warmth of imminent hypothermia. But Maggie's constant instructions bypassed everything with an electrifying willpower. The flare's chemical light seemed to fade, leaving only grey. I was losing my peripheral vision. The tunnel walls caved inwards, and a stabbing pain began pounding beneath my ribcage. The need to breathe was a physical agony. I know it hurts. Just keep kicking. There's a light ahead. You can make it. For a few seconds, I was too disorientated to understand. But then I realized that my head had broken the surface and I was breathing beautiful, rich breaths that reached right down to my toes. My limbs were so heavy, I was content to just let myself float. Unbidden, I felt a smile part my lips and heard my own laughter.
Congratulations, Miss Croft. You are positively Amazonian. That vault has defeated us for months.
I whirled, sending up a burst of spray. Eckhart stood, sneering down at me from a metal gantry. The shadow of Gunderson loomed beside him, as did the furtive bulk of Dr. Muller. Even from my disadvantaged position, I could also tell there was a figure lying, bound and gagged, at Eckhart's feet. My stomach did a barrel roll. It was Curtis. For the second time in 5 minutes, I felt my grip on reality slipping. But the reason wasn't lack of oxygen. It was fury. For a dizzying instant, I wanted to fly up and wrap my hands around Eckhart's scrawny throat. Nothing else would have satisfied me except to choke the life from him, to wipe that sadistic leer from his face and see the fire die from his eyes. Eckhart seemed to sense my feelings. For the first time, I met his gaze directly and felt sickened to my bones. Even his smoked glasses could not hide the madness in those eyes. Here was a creature so old and so saturated with its own perversity that all else that the human man, Peter van Eckhart, had once exemplified had been consumed. All that remained was a rotting husk, barely able to contain the corruption bloating his spirit from within. The fact that this creature still walked and talked like a human being was pure coincidence.
Very impressive.
At his signal, Gunderson adjusted a control panel and a chamber filled with the whir of machinery. The water began draining away, and a wire mesh floor rose under my feet. Realization struck me. I must have escaped through a side tunnel that linked to more of Eckhart's excavations. The lifting mechanism slowed as the mesh became one with the rest of the floor. I quickly assessed my surroundings. The chamber was easily wide enough to have parked several double-decker buses abreast, and so tall that 2 or 3 could have been stacked on top of each other before they reached the ceiling. Ranks of heavy tunneling machinery occupied padlocked niches on the far side of the room. The balcony occupied by Eckhart's little gang provided a commanding view of proceedings, but the steel ladders that would have provided access were retracted a good 12 feet off the ground. I felt like a mouse trapped in a bucket, with hungry cats peering in over the sides. The key was to show no fear. Despite my near drowning, I could not let my captors see any weakness. My footsteps rang out as I strode over to them, and I slid my hand down, surreptitiously checking my gun. "What do you want, Eckhart?" In answer, he reached down and caressed Curtis's cheek, one glance stopping my own hand in its tracks. The message was clear, and I felt my heart thudding. For the first time, Curtis stirred, I couldn't see his face, but he obviously recognized Eckhart. I heard his breathing change to a snarl as he fought the gag, whilst Eckhart turned him this way and that, like a museum specimen.
I'm not interested in you or your friend, Miss Croft. Give me the painting, and you may both leave.
Damn! I bit my tongue hard enough to draw blood. My guns had never felt so tempting. Had I been alone, I wouldn't have hesitated. Whatever else Eckhart was, he wasn't stupid. Far from it, in fact. He knew, and I didn't know how he knew, that I only had one lever at that precise moment, and he wasn't hesitating to pull it. Curtis had tilted himself up to look at me, his eyes feverish with defiance. It was the worst cliché in all villaindom, to hold the hero or heroine's heart to ransom. But it had become a cliché precisely because 9 times out of 10, it worked. I'd vowed never to get involved with this level of scum, but convention and Eckhart's love of cruelty had other ideas. Damn him! What choice do I have? I spat and, unzipping my pack, threw the painting with all my strength. Eckhart caught it one-handed, without even looking.
Anderson, release Boaz.
The man stepped aside for his master and then calmly put his boot under Curtis's flank. I rushed forward and managed to help break his fall, and 2 seconds with my knife cut through his ropes and gag. His face was livid.
Damn it, Croft! Why didn't you just shoot him?
His consonants were slurred, and he swayed as if drunk. But I could see him fighting to assert his will to stay upright. His right eye squinted through swollen, bruised flesh, and there were ugly red wheals around his neck and wrists. Drugged and beaten, I thought, grinding my teeth. He held up a warning hand as I stepped closer, but the gesture held more reassurance than hostility. I noticed Curtis's own pistol was missing, but he calmly withdrew the metallic disc from beneath his shirt. You're welcome.
Not you, Muller. You useless piece of dross. You failed me too.
I heard the scientist pleading, babbling about loyalty. But then Gunderson's shadow eclipsed the gantry and Muller came tumbling down. He had no clue how to land properly, and the snap of shattering bone burst through the chamber like a gunshot. He rolled, howling in agony, and clasped at his ankle that was bent almost at a right angle. Curtis met my eye.
Come on, I'll give you a boost.
My confusion must have shown, but there was no time to argue. Eckhart had already disappeared. I holstered my guns and put my foot into Curtis's cupped hands. Just then, a metallic screeching erupted on the far wall. A doorway was rising, its winch mechanism sounding like it hadn't been used in years. Something stirred in the darkness beyond.
This old colleague of mine was once a human, before she displeased me, of course. It seems that close acquaintanceship with Muller's specimen creates some interesting effects. Study her well.
The shadows came together, forming a solid mass more than twice the height of a man. I had the impression of too many legs on a vast, bloated body, with the knees arching high above its abdomen like a giant, corpulent spider. The last time I'd seen Boaz, She had been halfway down the gullet of a cross between a mutant lamprey eel and a subway train. If that was what Eckhart meant by close acquaintance, then I was determined to keep as far away as possible. On ponderous steps, the thing advanced, click-clacking its mandibles. I felt Curtis stiffen, and we both backed off several meters. I gulped, my guns suddenly seeming punny and infantile. Curtis traded me a look, and without needing to be told twice, I braced against his shoulders. Muller's shriek of terror jarred through my calm, but I was already launching off Curtis's hand with all my strength. The ridiculousness of this plan suddenly slammed home to me. There was simply no way I could reach the balcony from such a maneuver. But no sooner had the thought occurred to me when I felt a force like a giant hand scoop me up and carry my momentum 8 meters straight up. In shock, I managed to grab the railings and scramble to safety, wincing from fresh bruises. Behind me, Curtis lowered his hand and winked. Wow. Curtis, come on!
Here, take these. You'll need them.
Infuriatingly, he calmly pulled the 2 periapt shards from his pocket and tossed them up to me. For a moment, I was speechless. Then Muller's screams jolted me back. The beast had reached him and had pinned him down under one enormous claw. The wounded scientist, shrieking, grew more frantic, becoming drowned out by even more horrific noises, and I turned away, my stomach rebelling. Curtis, however, stood as though carved from granite. He looked so small and vulnerable, still with blood trickling down his cheek. But his face betrayed no hint of fear. These things are your speciality, Curtis. Get your ass up here.
I can't self-jump. Don't worry about me and Ugly. Go on, Croft. You're wasting time. I'll catch you up.
You'd better. For a moment, I contemplated throwing down the Viper. But the last thing I wanted was to face Eckhart with just my pistols. Besides, Curtis may have seemed defenseless. But with that disc on his side, he was probably better equipped than I was. I drew my guns and raced down the gantry to the exit. My quarry couldn't have gotten far.
In episode 18 of Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, Lara Croft was played by J.R. Millward. Curtis Trent, Pieter van Eckhart, Dr. Grant Muller, and Martin Gunderson were played by Adam Coover. Written and adapted by J.R. Millward. Based on an original story by A. Murty Schofield. With music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Additional sound effects courtesy of www.freesfx.co.uk, the BBC, and the YouTube Audio Library. Produced by Stephen Millward. Lara Croft and Tomb Raider are the property of Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix.